a land that was very rocky and stony, and it might take quite a bit of it to feed a cow. So and they could stay, you could tell that would, so that the amount of land to feed 3 cows was known as, you'd never guess it, by the ancient equivalent for a cool. Yes. Now this doesn't mean now that there was slavery right down until this time, but a slave woman in ancient times was considered the equivalent in value of 3 cows.
So they called the land?
They called the land, which was equivalent, an amount of land which was the grass of 3 cows, a cool. So that's very interesting. But as I said, don't think that meant that slavery, that they were interchangeable. According to the word cool originally meant a female slave. In the days of slavery, a female slave was worth roughly 3 cows. The terminology continued long after slavery was extinct. I'll talk about slavery just for a second here. Slavery was a just in case you think that it was like a very important part, which in older times it was more important. But slavery was self-restraining in ancient Ireland. Not so much because of St. Patrick, but despite him. Patrick and the Christians, give themselves a lot of credit for. They give him credit for everything. They give themselves credit as wiping out slavery, and certainly he raved tremendously against slavery, mainly because he was a little sore spot. He had been a slave himself. But the Irish never accepted St. Patrick's Christian concept of marriage and legitimacy, not even right down into Elizabethan times. As a result, the son or daughter of a slave by a boara, or even a nobleman, had the same standing as his quote-unquote legitimate children. Thus its growth was internally restricted. So I've often maintained that while it was there, it wasn't something that was going to explode. But there's no doubt it was there. And incidentally, or interestingly enough, again as an aside, the main source of slaves in Ireland was Britain. And the Irish purchased them from the British. And the British were known for selling their children into slavery. And the port that was prime in conducting that trade was Bristol. So Bristol was a slave port from England to Ireland long before slavery, long before it carried on its ancient trade. I just thought I'd throw that in there for a moment. And of course, as we know, Patrick was brought back as a slave, but I suspect that was as a result of raiding rather than as a result of trade, although who knows. Now I want to talk about the Tua. We've talked about the various stratas of society, and now we're only talking now about those who are on the ladder, on the rung to land ownership. There's a whole lot of other people who are not going to get there, who are basically farm labourers and other professions. The Tua was both a political and an economic unit. Very important to understand. It had a complete internal economy based on the communal ownership of the area of land defined by its recognized boundaries. Now I say all of those words very carefully because recognized boundaries. In fact, most of the neighboring Tuaths had, what would you call it, treaties. They had understanding, pardon? Agreements. I was looking for another word. Anyway, but they're fine with each other. So, pardon? No, more than alliance. I will come back to it in a moment. But the treaties is probably as good a word as any. that they recognized each other's borders. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't border battles all the time, unfortunately. But in theory, or in principle at least, the borders were recognized. Now, the fact that it was internally self-sufficient is incredibly important, because in many ways that is why it was a Tuath. And if you look at them, and if you see, roughly, if you're studying Irish and you look at them, they roughly are equivalent to the modern baronies. If you look at the baronies, they're very, if you look at the barony, I think you'll agree with that, Robert, that baronies, if you look at the various baronies, which are a very old measure in Ireland, and I suspect, and I think a lot of other people have said so, that they tend to be the ancient Tuaths.
Could you spell that word again? That
baronies?
No.
Oh, Tuath. Well, it's, I mean, now in Ireland it's T,
yeah.
big Th, Tuath. There's no short T in Irish. It's all Th, or else H. The T is either Th or it's aspirated to H. So Tuath has two T's. One, the first one not aspirated, Th, and the second one aspirated, H. Tuath. So it's T-U-A, Th,
that's a
Shavia,
measurement
dot.
of land.
Well, no, it's an economic and political unit,
Oh, okay.
which corresponds on the map of Ireland today
To a
into
barony,
baronies.
yeah.
Baronies, yes, which came in, which were used by the English in their administration. In other words, anglicised versions. They were used to the idea of baronies over there, and then shires later on, which became counties, and counties superimposed on baronies. But all of those more recent subdivisions are post-Norman or Tudor conquest. There's two great conquests in Ireland, the Norman conquest and the Tudor conquest, in case you hadn't kind of figured that out from my talking earlier. Now, the Tuath, I want to talk now about the Tuath. So it's important that you first of all understand T-U-A-T, only the second T is aspirated, and it's yes. And nowadays we call it, it would be written T-U-A-T-H. So we put a little H after the T to show that it's aspirated. And it looks horrible. It really is. So thank goodness we're going back to a font which is true to the old script. So a Tuath was both a political and an economic unit. And as I said, it was an economic unit first and a political unit second. And it had a complete internal economy based on communal ownership, or at least a concept of ownership, of the area of the land defined by its recognised borders. So the Muncher na Tuatha, the people of the Tuath, all the various names that they were called, I mentioned them earlier, Tuathana, which, you know, the people of Anach, the people Tuathana, the people of the Tuath. Áiteach is people from around the place. Áit is a place. Áiteach, from this place. You know, those are all names that you'll find. There's lots of others, but that are common and understood in the Irish language. The Irish language is rich with those kind of words. But as I said earlier, the Tuath was the equivalent to a modern country. It was a nation. And it was interesting in O'Neill's letter to Queen Elizabeth, and as because he was writing essentially to the court, and he was writing in English, and of course he'd been educated in English, although he spoke English. He actually he called them the nations. So it's sort of like the Indians here, where we talk about the nations. So it's very similar to that. They had autonomy. They had sovereign, and they owned their lands. Very, very similar, actually, and probably was fairly typical all around the world. That you know a people came into ownership of a peninsula, a valley, an island, something which was an economic unit. You could see that they had everything they needed for self-sustaining. We're using the great word now, sustainability. You know, that's the big buzzword in today's world. Well, they understood sustainability long before we did. in a real sense. Now, each Tua had a Taoiseach, elected from a royal household, and an elected Taoiseach, or Taoiseach, ready to succeed him. Now, I use the word Taoiseach very carefully and because there's lots of words, rees, all kinds of things. I prefer the word Taoiseach, and so did the young Irish state when it became independent. It used the words Ara for ministers and Taoiseach for the Prime Minister, and the word Taoiseach or Taoiseach for the Vice President, not Vice President, but the Vice Prime Minister, so to speak. I like them for that reason, and they were good choices. They did choose very well.